Ustedes saben que estamos viviendo en sociedades
You know that we live in societies that are having a sort of a roar, a demand, a bloody demand really, asking for punishment. And the society is echoing something that is completely opposed to the traditional values of racialized communities, but also the values of the left wing in all countries. And it's about not making our penal code more solid, not giving more power to the police to work inside our own communities. Nonetheless, as you all know, and as I know, what we are seeing in the Spanish state is actually the opposite. And we have to talk about that this afternoon, about those answers, those demands for increasing punishment in our states and how they're not working. And the fact that the only thing that they do is increase the risk of a society that is ever more conflictive. And for that, we have here today Fania Elizabeth Davis, whom I want to thank once again for having come here with us. Fania was born in Birmingham, Alabama, and she is an international voice in restorative and racial justice. She was an activist for social justice for decades, and she is a lawyer who is specializing in civil rights. She is also a writer who talks about civil rights. She's an educator with a doctorate, a PhD, and she's also an international speaker on racial justice and true processes, indigenous processes, and she also introduces herself as a mom, as a dancer, as a meditator, as a practitioner of African intellectuality. As you all know, she became of age in Alabama during the beginning of the era of civil rights. These formative years, but more especially the assassination of her two close friends during the Sunday Church attack in '63 crystallized her engagement, her long-lasting engagement with social transformation. During the following decades, Fania participated actively in those movements for civil rights in the US in favor of the liberation of Black people, also in movements for the rights of women, for imprisoned people, for peace, economic justice, and against violence against racialized people and against apartheid. The final learning with indigenous African healers was a catalyst in her search for a healing justice, which finally led her to being the founder and director of the Foundation Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth. And she is a member of the National Association of Community and Restorative Justice. She has numerous awards. I will not be listing them all today. I think that the most important thing probably is the fact that many of the media call her the leading voice for restorative justice in the 21st century. And I would like to thank Fania. I would like to thank you especially for being with us this week, because this week, as we all know, it's been 2 years since Europe in general and Spain in particular proved their institutional racism, their most cruel and illegal racism, by perpetrating the Melilla massacre. During that massacre, Fania, almost 40 Black people were executed extrajudicially in the southern Spanish frontier. And I would like to remind you all of the fact that while these 40 people were being assassinated extrajudicially during the Melilla massacre, others, hundreds, were expulsed illegally from the European territories, but many of them as well were tortured, and some of them disappeared in the hands of the different states, the Moroccan and Spanish states, financed by the EU. While all of these people were suffering, We have actually had to witness an opportunistic spectacle this week by politicians, even those who call themselves feminist and anti-racists. They have said that they were the defenders of the people who were massacred in Melilla when 2 years ago they were part of the government that massacred them. They were sitting down round the table of the Council of Ministers, and they decided not just to remain silent, but actively they covered those crimes up, which are crimes against the whole of humankind. And this is the situation that we face in Spain, Fania. There is a dehumanization of racialized people who make Europe and who make Spain on a daily basis. And the left is asking for more punitivism, as I was saying previously. They're renouncing the progressive tradition of withholding that power from the state. We know that punitivism is going against us, against all of us, and that can be shown in the figures of racialized people who are sentenced and imprisoned daily. Against this reality, rethinking the paradigms of justice with an anti-colonialism perspective, an anti-racist perspective, is not just necessary but urgent. We need to understand that punishing and producing and hurting racialized childhoods cannot be the right path. That is urgent for us to think about. When I think about this, I also think that very often we have to think about the amount of people who are imprisoned unfairly, unjustly, in what we call foreigners' internment centers, which are actually jails for political prisoners, because they are being imprisoned because of who they are, not of what they do. And now that we have you here today, we are hopeful, Fania, and we know that this conversation, this dialogue with you will allow us to think about other models for conflict resolution and to fight against racism. We now give you the floor, and I thank you once again for being here today.
Thank you so much, Adilia de las Mercedes, Asociación de Mujeres de Guatemala, and Blanca Rosillo, La Casa Encendida, and all of you on the teams, the organizing teams who made this event possible. I'm deeply humbled and honored to be joining such prominent world leaders, Nobel Prize winners such as Rigoberta Menchú and even my sister Angela Davis. I also want to acknowledge each and every one of you for being here today. As Adilia said, it's raining outside. So thank you for coming. I know there are other things that you could be doing. And thank you for doing what you do to bring social justice and to protect our earth. And to promote peace and healing in the world. Just on the 24th and all of this week, as Adilia said, you've been commemorating the massacre at Melilla. And I want to acknowledge all the souls lost, disappeared, and injured on that day at the hands of the Spanish state. So, I mostly want to talk to you about restorative justice. And before I get into the direct discussion of restorative justice, I'd like to just tell you a little bit about my journey to restorative justice and to racial justice. How it is that I came to be a racial justice activist as well as a restorative justice practitioner. I'm going to use the slides. Oops, I'm going to take this out now because. Sorry about that. So I was born in Birmingham, Alabama, in the southern United States. We call that Bombingham, Alabama. It is the most, at the time especially, was the most violent city and the most segregated city. It was like apartheid. Give me a moment while I accustom myself to the technology here. Yeah. So, what was it like growing up in the most segregated and violent city in the United States back in the early 50s? I have memories, the earliest memories are of my father running down the stairs and grabbing his gun to protect our family from racial terrorists that were lurking outside our home. The fathers in my neighborhood, by the way, my neighborhood was called Dynamite Hill. So I'm from Birmingham, Alabama, living atop Dynamite Hill. So the bombings happened. Some of my earliest memories are also of bombings that happened in our neighborhood because black people moved into a previously all-white neighborhood. And of course, we were targeted by the racists, the Ku Klux Klan, and the racial terrorists because of our activism, because we were pushing the color line, because we were bringing down the walls of segregation. Also, me and my siblings learned how to read with these signs. These were the first words that we learned how to spell. These are colored, for colored or white only. These are the signs of apartheid. And these are the images of Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. You may have already seen some of these. The hoses, the dogs, the children. Children in the first grade, children who were 6 years old, 7 years old, marched on the streets of Birmingham. And they responded, the government responded by putting dogs on them and high-power hoses that knocked their bodies against the wall. Shores was an attorney, a great civil rights attorney, who inspired me to become a civil rights attorney. And his home was bombed 4 times. 4 times, and he took to sitting on his porch with a shotgun to protect his family. And miraculously, none of his family were seriously injured. And as Adelia mentioned, 4 of my 4 girls, young black girls in Birmingham, were assassinated in a dastardly bombing while they were in Sunday school, while they were at church. And the girls on the bottom row, Carol Robertson and Cynthia Wesley, were my good friends who were lost in that bombing. So all of these things, and maybe I'll share a little story with you that I shared yesterday about my mother and how she was so influential in my development as an activist and in the development of my siblings, especially Angela Davis as an activist. When we would ask our mother, why can't we go swimming? Why is this swimming pool for whites only? Mother, why can't we ride on the roller coaster at the carnival? Why is it that we have torn, dirty, used books from the white schools? We can't get our own new books. And why is it that we can't go to the theater when we are downtown? Because of our skin color. She said, children, it's not supposed to be this way. And it won't always be this way. And she said, you children are the ones who are going to make a difference. You are the ones who will change the world. And so in many ways, the rest of my life, as an activist and now as a restorative justice practitioner, are following my mother's instructions and taking her charge to be an activist to change the world. So after leaving Alabama, I became involved in the civil rights movement, the Black Panther movement, the Black Power movement, women's movement, socialist movement, economic justice movements, and all of the major movements of my time. I was also inspired by my sister's attorney to become a civil rights lawyer. After we left Birmingham, my then husband and I And in English, we say husband for ex-husbands. So my husband and I were very involved with the Black Panthers in California. And as a result of that, we were attacked by police officers. They broke into our home and shot and almost killed my husband. And we were charged after with attempted murder of police officers. A very courageous judge dropped the charges 3 times, but the prosecutor kept on reinstating the indictment against us. And finally, after the 3rd time, the prosecutor gave up and the case against us was dismissed. But just 6 months after we were attacked by police, my sister was under attack. She was targeted in 1970 on serious capital charges of murder, conspiracy, and kidnapping. And she faced the gas chamber if she were committed in a court. Because she thought that she would be killed if she were apprehended, my sister went underground. So many Panthers, and she was a Panther, and other activists were killed by the police. She went underground and was underground for 3 months when they finally captured her. And of course, then President Nixon, congratulated the FBI and cheered them on for having captured my sister, who he branded as a terrorist. There is the FBI wanted poster. And this wanted poster gave license to every racial terrorist to shoot her on sight. Fortunately, she survived that time underground and survived the capture by police. And my family and I and many others throughout the world responded by creating a massive movement, an international movement that would be powerful enough to free Angela Davis. Have any of you seen the film Free Angela Davis and All Political Prisoners? Yes. Yeah? A few of you have? Great. It's one that I recommend. It tells the story of the whole trial and the movement that was created and organized, a massive movement, an amazing movement, and it demonstrated the power of the people. The jury verdict was, of course, acquittal. And it was not so much the fairness of our legal system, our criminal justice system. Many people would say, after Angela was acquitted, oh, so you should now believe in the fairness of the justice system in this country. I said, no, it wasn't the fairness of the justice system that resulted in her acquittal. It was a power of masses, of millions of people around the world, tens of millions here in Europe even, and in other parts of the world that came together, that organized and mobilized and demanded her freedom that led to her acquittal. It was the power of the people. After Angela was acquitted, I continued my activism, but then I was inspired by the lawyers in her case to go to law school and became a civil rights lawyer and did that. Did that for almost 30 years, while I was also an activist. And 30 years of being angry against injustice, 30 years of rage against Birmingham because of the bombings, 30 years of rage against police for what happened to my husband, and rage against the system for having attempted to murder and execute my sister, Angela Davis. And 25 years of fighting racism in the courtroom. I was filled with this anger, so much so that I became ill. And I knew intuitively that I needed to bring more healing energies into my life. As I drink water, water is very healing. The waters of healing help to balance the fires of hatred and rage. And I knew I needed to bring more feminine energies and spiritual and creative energies into my life. And synchronistically, and magically in some ways, I was led to a healer in South Africa, Credo Mutwa, Busamazulu Credo Mutwa. And he initiated me as a traditional healer. I went through that process for about 7 years. I also was writing a dissertation on indigenous healing at that time. And then when I returned from Africa and the work that I did with the healers there, I went to a conference. Well, first of all, I had to come back to this country and practice law again. I didn't want to ever go into courts again and didn't ever want to practice law again. But that was the only remunerative profession that I couldn't find any work healing. There was simply not a demand at that time, right? As much as it is needed. That's changed, as I'll say later. I discovered restorative justice as a lawyer. I went to a lawyer's conference, and they talked about restorative justice. And for the first time, I felt that I could be both a warrior for justice and a healer. I didn't have to reject one and embrace the other in a binary fashion. I could be both. And restorative justice gave me this sort of framework to allow me to be both a warrior and a healer. Mm-hmm. As you are, my dear Adelia, and as many of you in the audience are probably. So restorative justice was a game changer. It arose in the mid-1970s in the United States, and it is a justice that seeks not to punish, but to heal. It is a justice that is not about getting even, but about getting well. It is a justice that seeks to repair broken lives and communities rather than damage them further. It is a justice that seeks to bring peace rather than deepen conflict. It's a healing justice. And now I want to just screen this video, which is going to give you a sense of the fundamentals. It's very short, 3 minutes. Mm-hmm.
If crime hurts, then justice should heal. That's Fania Davis. It makes sense, right? Unfortunately, that's not what we're doing. In the US, there are 2.2 million people behind bars and nearly 5 million on probation and parole in a system of mass incarceration laden with racial injustices that disproportionately affect minority communities. 1 out of every 14 children has a parent in prison, destroying the health, stability, and resources of entire communities. This is the retributive justice system, and it operates on the theory that punishing people for crime makes them stop. It's hugely expensive, destructive to the human spirit, and worst of all, it doesn't work. Psychiatrist James Gilligan even calls it the most powerful stimulant of violence that we've yet discovered. People are looking for another system. Fortunately, there is one. It's called restorative justice. It focuses less on punishing the crime and more on holding people accountable in order to heal the harm. Restorative justice is based on who we really are. We're designed to live in community, to be of service to one another, and to nurture and repair our relationships. Where the retributive system asks, who did it, what rule was broken, and how do we punish them? Restorative justice asks, what is the harm? Who has been harmed? How do we repair it? Here's how it works. All the stakeholders get a chance to be heard in a facilitated process that balances the needs of victims, offenders, and the community. The person harmed explains how he or she was hurt. This itself is healing as it meets the need for acknowledgement, validation, and repair. The person who did the harm is held accountable in a new way. They're also given the opportunity to accept responsibility for their actions, which is also healing, share their perspectives, and to make amends for the harm they caused in the relationships that were broken. The whole community has a chance to address the underlying problems that gave rise to this situation, and then everyone works together to find a way to restore balance and offer healing to all stakeholders. In restorative and community justice, the concept of beloved community and living in right relationship is key. You're restoring justice and just relationships within the whole community. Does it work? Well, look at this. In the prison system, wherever restorative justice is tried, recidivism has plummeted. In schools, switching to restorative justice drops suspension, improving students' educational and social well-being while reducing bullying and other manifestations of violence. And it costs next to nothing by comparison. One teacher said, "Every time I used the retributive system, I lost a relationship. Every time I use this new system, I gain one." Restorative justice is justice that works, justice that transforms, justice that heals. Now that sounds like something we all want more of in our communities, so spread the word in yours.
Okay, so as you can see, restorative justice invites a paradigm shift in the way that we think about and do justice. It asks very different questions. Our current system asks what law was broken, who broke it, and what punishment is deserved. It judges, it blames, judges, and punishes. That's the essence of our current criminal justice system. Restorative justice is focused on the harm. What is the harm? Who was harmed? And how do we repair the harm? Restorative justice flips the script. Let me offer another little sort of story to illustrate the difference between restorative justice and our current retributive justice. So imagine you're in a small village and you see a grandmother in the center of the plaza with two children, holding hands of two children who appear to be her grandchildren. And then a young man runs up to her, rushes her, and grabs her purse, knocks her down, and then runs away. One would say that our justice system would just run after the person causing the harm who has the purse. It's very offender-focused on blaming, judging, and punishing. But what about the persons who've been harmed? Restorative justice is a holistic justice, and it looks at, it goes first of all to the persons harmed, the victims. What would you do? You probably would first ask, well, how's the grandmother? Is she okay? What are her needs? Does she need some medical care, emergency medical care? And once having done that, you'll probably go to the little children. Were they traumatized? How can you comfort them? And how can you hold them after this big fright that they've had? So restorative justice would do what you would do. Take care of the children, take care of the grandmother, find out their needs and address their needs. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the difference between the two. Now, it doesn't mean that restorative justice is going to let the person with the purse get off. Restorative justice will also attend to the needs. Why did he do this? And how can he repair this harm? How can we hold him accountable for this? Can he learn from this mistake that he made, rather than just be punished for it, rather than just be incarcerated, where he won't learn a thing, except how to be a better criminal. And he won't even think about what he did to the grandmother and their children, because he'll be so focused on doing his time on his calendar and checking off every day until it's time for him to get out. Does that make sense? Yeah. I didn't hear much. I heard one person say, yep. Yes? Okay. All right. So restorative or retributive justice is a justice that responds to the first harm with another harm. It harms people who harm people, presumably to show that harming people is wrong. but it engages in precisely the behavior that it says is wrong, right? Go figure, it just doesn't make sense. Restorative justice seeks to break this cycle of harm and responds to harm with healing. The thing is, if you're responding to the original harm with another harm, you're just replicating harm, you're reproducing harm, right? And we don't need more harm in this world. Our world is already saturated with harm. And as I always say, ours is a culture of harm. We were born in our country into racism and land theft and colonization and genocide and heteropatriarchy. And this is a giant generator of harm that continues to this day, obviously. We have become experts. We've been socialized in this harming culture. And we know very well how to harm. Unfortunately, harm our planet, harm our bodies, our children, our communities, our waters. We're very good at that. But if we're to have a future, we must become healers. We must become healers. And we have to learn that no matter what you do professionally, whether you are a janitor, a street sweeper, a professor, or a worker in a factory, all of us must learn, I think, to become healers. And restorative justice offers a toolkit for that. Let's see. I think I went through those questions. So I just want to say that restorative justice is a contemporary iteration of indigenous insights and values. We are socialized to believe in Western culture that the desire to inflict counterviolence upon or to punish or retaliate against someone who has hurt us or a beloved one is innate, that we have this innate desire to strike out and retaliate when someone does us harm. And we're conditioned to believe that justice has always been centered on vengeance, on official vengeance and retaliation. Bless you. And that it has always been done that way and will always be done that way. How many of you think that it's natural to want to strike at someone who has harmed you or a beloved one? Okay, well, you're obviously, one person. But most people believe, unlike this audience, which is a very special audience, most people believe that when you're harmed, that it's innate to want to strike back and retaliate. We're made to believe that this is an absolute truth of our punitive law system, of our carceral law system, that it's actually some sort of natural law, and that it's always been this way. In fact, in the long sweep of human history, the retributive, carceral, punitive way of doing justice is very recent and came into prominence only about 4 centuries ago. Restorative justice has been the dominant model of criminal justice through most of human history. This transition from community-centered justice to state-centered justice, from restorative justice to carceral justice, arose with the emergence of the nation-state. Racial capitalism, slavery, the slave trade, genocide, land theft, colonialism, and with the drive to consolidate state power. For most of human history, reconciliation and restitution to victims and their kin took precedence over vengeance. This is because restoring social peace and avoiding blood feuds were paramount social concerns in indigenous and pre-capitalist societies. Restitution and reconciliation, not punishment, were overarching aspirations. Indeed, in most indigenous language, there is no word for prison. There's no word conception of prisons in indigenous cultures. If you stole something or hurt someone, you and family members would pay restitution. For instance, in Africa with maize, palm oil, chickens, goats, or cows. And your family members would exert a corrective influence on you. Your wrongdoing is shamed, the act itself is shamed, but not you. Extended family would urge you to empathize with the person harmed, acknowledge the wrong, apologize for it authentically, and make amends. Restorative justice, like Indigenous justice, focuses on repairing and rebuilding in order to strengthen relationships and bring social harmony. And also, as the video notes, restorative justice is evidence-based. There have been more studies on the effectiveness of restorative justice than on the effectiveness of any other alternative way of doing justice. And I briefly want to say before we close for discussion that, why don't we go ahead and start the discussion now?
Bueno, según te escuchaba,
As I was listening to you, and yesterday I did ask you this question because I thought it was a very personal question, but we have said from the feminist movement that what's personal is political as well. So it's probably the most important question for me at this moment in time, and I want to ask you the question before we start this debate with the audience. And I'm also going to take advantage of being the moderator to ask a couple questions to Fania before we have a conversation with everyone in the room. You talked about Angela Davis's story. She's not only very loved, but also very well known the world over. And what really impacts me is the way in which, as a society, we always put aside and we do not know and do not recognize people who, as in your case, have the function of defending the defender, because you were defending the defender, the healer that heals. And I think that this idea is very deep, because all people, with no exception, the world over, need to be cared for. We need to be cared for. And in general, we see the person in front of us, in front of our eyes, and who personifies this fight against injustice, but we never see those who are behind that person, that symbol, and who are supporting that person. And I do think that at a moment in time where finally in the Western society we're starting to talk about putting the care for life in the center of everything, to talk about the caregivers and who defends those who defend. I think it's really important to talk about that. I know that talking about oneself is always difficult, but I want you to share this reflection about your life as a healer who heals the healers.
Thank you. Well, in terms of defending the defendants, I dedicated my life to freeing my sister Angela Davis, and it wasn't something I had to think about. It wasn't something I had to reflect on. It's just something I did reflexively and instinctively. I stopped everything. I was pregnant with my daughter at the time. And nonetheless, I traveled all over the world and attended demonstrations and did everything I could, even to the point where the doctor says, you've got to stop because you've got a baby coming and you can't go at this pace. But that desire, that passionate commitment to defend my sister and save her life was something very natural to me. I think when I was a small child, I would always kind of defend the kids who were being bullied too. So that's part of who I am. And this question of who heals the healers is very, very important, because the organization that I founded, Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, we go into right where the violence is happening, and after gun violence, for example, we go into neighborhoods and we do healing circles and we do grief circles and we do repasts. Those would be like meals for the community, food for the community. We plant peace trees, and that helps to prevent retaliatory violence, secondary violence. And we go into the prison, or the juvenile justice system, where the young people are incarcerated. And sometimes the young people have killed others, even their parents in some cases. We go into the units where the young people who have committed violent crimes are housed. And we engage with them one-on-one. We sit with them in circle. We hear their stories. We cry with them. We laugh with them and spend hours in their company. And very often, when we come out of there, we are drained and in need of healing ourselves. And so we are working out ways to protect ourselves energetically before going into these spaces, without impairing the connection and the relationship, because the youth can feel our care and our love. But it's important for us to heal ourselves and protect ourselves before we go into the spaces and after we come out, to do cleansing ceremonies. And we're actually working with African traditional healers to develop these kinds of cleansing processes. And then for me, myself, I do Qigong, I do Tai Chi, I do yoga. And I used to dance a lot. I don't dance as much. And I try to eat good food that's healthy for my body. And I try to be around energies that are healthy for me. People who are not going to infect me with negative energies. It's like you don't want to eat a lot of junk food, right? Because that's harmful to your body. And you don't want to be around a lot of negative energy. As much as you may love someone, it's important to establish those boundaries so that you can be capable of continuing this work. So that's an important question for any practitioner of restorative justice and any healing practitioner. How do we heal ourselves? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Gracias.
Sure.
Thank you. I also wanted to ask you what it is that you think about a topic that really I find interesting. You said that in many languages, many indigenous African languages, the word prison does not exist. And I wanted to share with you, based on my own experience and with much respect towards the Sepursarco community, and I'm sure that some of you know that this is a community where women were victims of sexual slavery for a very long time, during years and years during the armed conflict in Guatemala. And many of these women in Sepursarco wanted for that situation to be resolved somehow. But when the researchers started asking, what is it you want? In their language, which is the Quechua language, which is a Mayan language, they didn't have the word justice. So in many of the indigenous communities, you don't have the word prison, you don't have the word justice. So the closest concept that they found, because Quechua is a conceptual language, was, and I always say this, it's a concept that has a very deep load to it, because the concept is the person who has the last word. So the person who has the last word, that is the concept for justice in the Quechua language. And it's very deep. And I actually think if it doesn't exist in so many indigenous languages, African and Latin America, these words such as prison, judge, even justice, I think about these conquistadors that reached our lands, the lands of our grandparents, and who didn't find judges, they didn't find prosecutors, they didn't find courts. They thought that the community didn't have any systems to solve conflicts. So they imposed their own way of conflict resolution. a way that was based, obviously, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, which was then transferred to the penal system, the Roman-German penal system, which is the one that we currently have. A system where actually, and you said it very often, what we have is the idea that people are born in sin and evilness, but the people in these places where the words prison, justice, judge, prosecutor did not exist, and where these institutions did not exist, they think that people are good for nature, and by nature we are born good, but we commit mistakes. Could you maybe dig deeper into those two ideas?
Well, that was pretty deep. I'll try my best. Yeah, that is totally true. And invisible to the eyes of invaders and colonizers, when they didn't see prisons and courts and judges and prosecutors, and thought therefore these were uncivilized peoples, invisible to their eyes were the omnipresent ceremonies and values and just assumptions and principles about the interconnection of every being, every human being and every earth being, our inherent interrelatedness. And invisible to their eyes were the ways that indigenous people addressed conflict and transformed conflict. For example, in Benin, if some conflict had occurred, the persons involved in the conflict would come into a very small space. They couldn't even stand up to get in. They'd have to really sit down low or get down low. And when they were seated, they couldn't stand up. And that way they could have a conversation without fighting because they were confined in the space. There were just so many clever ways of sewing back the torn fabric of society. And the ceremonies actually created deep community. That's really what I want to say. Their practices, their ceremonies, their education, all created this deep sense of community. And as it has been said by a very famous freedom fighter in the United States, that without deep community, we cannot survive. If we are to survive as a people, we must live in deep community. And I think indigenous peoples had a very strong technology to a strong communitarian ethos and strong technologies of the sacred, which allowed them to every day, every moment experience their interconnection with one another. So that the colonizers could not see. There was something else I wanted to add, and it's the last part of your question. Let's see. Mm-hmm.
With regards to the lack of those words in their vocabulary, maybe?
Yes, but well, let me just put it this way. Let's come to the present time. So we did restorative justice work in schools, the organization that I founded, for many years, and we found that schools had become prisonized in the United States. This is what we were up against. When children had milk fights in the cafeteria, they were arrested for assault. If they wrote on the desk, they were arrested for defacing public property. And so in these ways, things that young people do naturally and adolescents do naturally were all criminalized. And so we went into the schools to disrupt the school-to-prison pipeline, to disrupt this prisonization. And there was a lot of fighting going on in the schools, and especially in the schools that we worked in under-resourced areas. So, Adelia, one of the things that we didn't just use restorative justice whenever conflict broke out to solve the conflict or to resolve the conflict. We spent more time on restorative justice circles that would strengthen relationships and create deep community amongst the young people, so that if conflict did break out, they would be able to resolve it in a healthy way. We taught them how to talk through instead of fight through their differences. So if you have a community that is constantly engaged in these practices of being in community and living in respect and in deep relationship with a sense of responsibility, then you're less likely to have unhealthy conflict. And so we are learning from indigenous peoples in that we are engaged in these processes that deepen the sense of community. Because once people get to know one another and feel very close to one another, they're less likely to engage in harm with one another. And I want to just share one other story. When we trained people in restorative justice, like teachers who had been knowing each other for 10 years, teaching at the same school. But when they sat in a restorative justice peacemaking circle, they said, since I've been in this circle for 2 hours and I've learned more about, and I feel closer to my colleague than I did in all of the 10 years that we worked together. So these restorative justice technologies, relationship building technologies, are really more important in some ways than the restorative justice that you do once conflict has occurred. So developing values, common values, and being in deep community with one another is something that we borrow from indigenous communities, and that makes a difference in creating a healthy community where less harm will occur. Does that make sense?
Absolutamente.
Absolutely. And I'm very much interested by this topic, and I would like to talk about it a bit further if possible, because you haven't really dig deep into this part. You were talking about young people, and you were talking, and I wanted to talk to you. I wanted to ask you about childhood, because in Silvia Federici's wonderful book, I'm sure you know this book by Silvia Federici about the witch, and she refers to an indigenous people in Canada, where the Jesuits set up their first churches in Canada. And in that place, one of the Jesuits wrote down his memories, and he told how the colonizers had to teach the people how to punish their children, because they were sacred in the community. Children were a gift to the community. And punishing them, harming them, was forbidden. And it was one of the most serious vulnerations of the rules of the community. So how do you see that evolution that it has seen, that colonialism has had as a way of punishing from a very early age these creatures, these children, so that they could mold their thoughts, so that they could somehow change their households, so that their households would become concentration camps, so that they could be prepared for the colonial plantation, to prepare them later on for the industry, and to start conceiving this prison system that many of them will feed in the end.
Yeah, it's the harm that is issued from our origins in slavery, slave trade, genocide, land theft, the schools, the boarding schools, the residential schools, is still very much present. And it's everywhere, it's omnipresent, it's in the air that we breathe, it's That's why I say restorative justice is about a paradigm shift from harming to healing that is absolutely needed today if we are to have a future. It's very simple in that sense, this paradigm shift that I'm talking about, and it's very complicated to actually change that paradigm. And we in the restorative justice movement are part of the movements that exist today that seek to change that paradigm to move from harming to healing. I think that's horrible. And Black families too have engaged in corporal punishment. That's beginning to change, but it's clear from research that corporal punishment is a direct descendant of slavery. And the way that Black people were so viciously wounded and whipped and tortured and beaten on a daily basis, constantly. And so we sort of absorbed that ethic and started doing it to our own children. So it's really, this work that we're doing is really about decolonization and interrupting all of the massive, unspeakable harms that have issued from these histories, which are still present with us, which have their afterlives in mass incarceration and many other harms today. Mm-hmm.
¿Y cuál es la experiencia de tu fundación?
And what is the experience of your foundation? Because you were talking yesterday to the media about the work with young people, and you were giving a figure which I thought was very impactful. I think you said that the fact that when a teenager or a child is suspended from their school, they have many more possibilities of being imprisoned in the future. Can you talk about that a bit more?
Sure. This relates to the prisonization of the school. School should be the safest place for our children. With the mass shootings that you've read about, I'm sure, I don't know if you have them here, it's not that way at all. Schools are becoming nightmares in some cases. Especially I'd say about 10 years ago, with the rise of mass incarceration, our schools became little prisons and practiced carceral, and they still are, practices essentially. And so if a kid curses out a teacher, for example, or if a kid pulls out the cell phone when the teacher has said, put it down, then that kid can be suspended. Which means, do you have suspensions here in your schools where a kid is pushed out of school for 10 days or so if they break a rule of some sort?
Something like that, but I think it's not so hard. You have to be a lot of strikes, so to say, and then you go out.
Okay, a lot of offenses
But
before.
I think USA is more harder.
Yeah. So the study I think that you were saying that I was referring to says that if a child is suspended once by the 9th grade, they are 3 times more likely to be incarcerated. And that's because if they're pushed out of school and into the streets because their parents are working, they're not home, then they are attracted by gangs and they get involved in gangs. And a child, a 10 or 11 or 12-year-old child with no supervision out on the streets is a recipe for a disaster. Yep. And so that happened all the time, that our children were suspended and they were expelled. And so we came in with restorative justice to provide alternatives to suspensions and expulsions and exclusionary discipline, which is what we called it. Well, I don't know what specifically you were referring to that I said. Was it about the...
Exactamente.
No, that was exactly it. Exactly what you said. The figures and the odds of being incarcerated. Those kids who before they're 11 have been suspended. And I wanted actually to just give you a nuance, because in the case of the Spanish system, we do have studies. They talk about the fact that the majority of suspended children are racialized. And if the boy or girl who has offended is racialized, in that case, you don't need more than one strike. You don't need more strikes to be suspended. So, okay, I know that we don't want to leave, that we could spend hours on end here together, but time flies and time is always limited. So I wanted to thank Fania once again for her presence here today. And I did want to leave some reflections flying around about the last message that Fania has shared with us. And I love that way of always seeing the glass half full before seeing it half empty, because we've worked a lot. And let us look at us here today talking about restorative justice, a topic that has never interested this state, the Spanish state, and that is why I want to thank you even more for the possibility that you have given us, because during the 10 years of this series of Women Against Impunity, La Casa Encendida has really given us a space, because it has allowed us to plant many different little seeds, and many in 10 years you will hear people talk about restorative justice, and it will be a topic that everyone understands, and we will all think that it was always there, but it wasn't always there. Things are not always done. There's always pioneers. There's always someone who's planting that first seed. And in Spain, we have other small seeds, but this seed is a very important seed, Fania, the one that you have planted here today. We will see it bloom in 10 years. I'm absolutely convinced. Just as we saw the fight for a new paradigm on feminicide, Blanca Rosillo, 15 years ago, when we started with that fight, we managed, the day after the event in this La Casa Encendida, we introduced that term in that archaic place, which is the Royal Academy of the Spanish language. So we have to trust what it is that we do together. We have to trust in our possibilities. We have to trust in the fact that this seed, like many others, will bloom, because restorative justice is really the paradigm of what we have heard talk about from white institutions, void of meaning, which is putting the victims at the center. But that is what restorative justice really is, to focus on the people who have been harmed and remember that everyone can be the ones causing harm at some point. And we have to have that very much present in our minds, because that punishment that we require is always comes back, and it comes back to our communities much stronger. So that is why we have to work with restorative justice, and we have to plant those seeds, because we have to rethink this paradigm of justice. And I am sure that those of us who had the privilege of being here today are going to bet on it. So we will be together in September for another series on Women Against Impunity. Thank you so much.